about his country's nuclear program and put testing on hold during possible negotiations with the United States. The president called that a positive step, but said, we'll see what happens. And the director of national intelligence says he is still skeptical about trying to negotiate with the North. More on those comments ahead. First, let's get to the chief White House correspondent, John Roberts, who's live this afternoon on the North Lawn. Hi, John.
Shep, good afternoon. We hope to hear more from the president on this when he meets with the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven in the East Room of the White House for a joint press conference, usually 2 questions per side. But I remember when we were in Hanoi in Vietnam back in November, my phone rang when I was sitting outside the presidential palace waiting for President Trump to arrive. It was President Trump on the phone. Among the things that he and I spoke about was North Korea and his approach to it. The president telling me, John, everybody thinks that I'm trying to start a war. What I'm trying to do is prevent a war. So this could be the opening that the president has been looking for. The fact that North Korea says that it will get together with South Korean officials, and this is Kim Jong-un, in South Korea, on the South Korean side of the Panmunjom border crossing there in late May, and then potentially sit down with the United States for talks about denuclearization. And that was the key element here that President Trump has been calling for, not a freeze of their nuclear program, not leaving it where it is, but denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Here's what the president said a short time ago in the Oval Office.
I'd like to be optimistic, but I think maybe this has gone further than anyone's taken it before. Nobody's been in the position. This should have been handled long ago. This should have been handled over many years by many different administrations. Not now. This was not the right time to handle it. But these are the cards we were dealt. We're handling it properly. And again, as I said, hopefully we'll go in the very, very peaceful, beautiful path. We're prepared to go whichever path is necessary. I think we're having very good dialogue, and you're going to certainly find out pretty soon what's happening. But we have made progress. There's no question about it.
We have made progress, no question about it. The president saying part of what made this possible was North Korea's participation in the Olympics. The president took some credit for making the Olympics a success in Pyeongchang, South Korea. And unlike the vice president, who was very critical of North Korea and their participation in the Olympics, the president had nice things to say. Listen here.
I thought North Korea was terrific. They came out, they went into the Olympics, they went in with good spirit, they did well. Let's see if we can carry it over. We may carry it over, it may not. It's a very tenuous situation. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Very interesting to see what happens. Now, again, the North has not agreed to the parameter for talks or even to have talks, just saying it's interested in doing it. But, Shep, in late May, when we see Kim Jong-un sit down with Moon Jae-in of South Korea, that could be the opening that everybody has been looking for to really kind of ratchet down tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Shep?
John, as you know, the president said odds with members of his own party over his plan for tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. The Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, said today the taxes are too broad and could lead to retaliation from other countries.
So what we're encouraging the administration to do is to focus on what is clearly a legitimate problem and to be more surgical in its approach so that we can go after the true abusers without creating any kind of unintended consequences or collateral damage.
Speaker Ryan has also said he's extremely worried about the consequences of a trade war. More reaction from lawmakers ahead. But President Trump said yesterday he is not backing down in his plan for tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, and said he does not expect there will be a trade war. Some U.S. allies have threatened to put taxes on American products if the president goes through with this plan. Let's get back to John Roberts at the White House. What's the latest, John?
Well, in fact, the president was probably hearing about it with the Swedish Prime Minister just a short time ago, Shep, and we hope to ask him about this at the press conference because the president of the European Commission phoned Prime Minister Löfven last night ahead of his bilateral meeting with the president to say if the president goes ahead with these tariffs on steel, the EU is prepared to retaliate by putting punitive penalties on American goods that are manufactured in some key Republican districts. And this would be motorcycles, jeans, and bourbon, among other things. So there you're targeting Wisconsin with motorcycles, Kentucky with bourbon, and jeans made several places across the United States. But the president is holding out an opening for Canada and Mexico to escape the tariffs. He says if they can come up with a better deal on NAFTA, well, maybe they just might be excluded from these tariffs. Listen to what the Treasury Secretary said earlier today on Capitol Hill.
To the extent that we're successful in renegotiating NAFTA, those tariffs won't apply to Mexico and Canada. But we look forward to the president releasing the specific details and working with other people. We're not looking to get into trade wars. We are looking to make sure that U.S. companies can compete fairly around the world.
Not looking to get into trade wars, but don't forget what the president tweeted last week, Shep, that trade wars are easy to win. You just put tariffs on their goods and you penalize them for their trade practices, and eventually you'll win that battle. But he's getting an awful lot of disagreement on that, Shep, from people in his own party.
John, President Trump warning of a possible staff shakeup inside the White House. This is from the president himself. He tweeted this morning, the new fake news narrative is that there's chaos in the White House. Wrong. People will always come and go, and I want strong dialogue before making a final decision. I still have some people that I want to change, always seeking perfection, he said parenthetically. There is no chaos, only great energy. Back to John Roberts at the White House. The reports have differed.
The what, Shep? I'm sorry?
The reports have been contrary to that particular narrative.
Hope Hicks is the latest one to leave. There's talk about whether General McMaster might be on the way out at some point, though people here at the White House are saying he's not leaving this month or next month. But there is a lot of churn in this White House. There's no question about that, perhaps more than many other White Houses than we've seen in the past. And Shep, I just want to go back to what we were hearing about yesterday, and that was Sam Nunberg, who was the former aide to the Trump campaign, who was only there for less than 2 months before he was fired by the president for racially tinged posts on his Facebook page. He had what a lot of people here at the White House are saying was a meltdown yesterday, talking about his time talking to investigators in the special counsel's office, the fact that he was going to refuse to abide by a subpoena that had been sent to him to appear before a grand jury and produce a lot of emails. His testimony was all over the place yesterday. Not his testimony, but his interviews were all over the place yesterday. There was collusion. There wasn't collusion. Mueller has got something on President Trump. President Trump might have done something during the election, but I don't really know for sure. So not sure where all of that is going to go, but the latest word from Nunberg appears to be that he is going to now comply with that subpoena and appear before the grand jury. Something else that happened today, Shep, and it wasn't really, I don't think in the grand scheme of things, a big deal. The Office of Special Counsel, and this is not Mueller, sent a report to the White House saying that Kellyanne Conway, on a couple of occasions in interviews last year, violated the Hatch Act, which separates the political wing, which separates the government wing of the White House from doing political activities. In the report, the OSC said in the first interview that Kellyanne Conway did, she advocated against one Senate candidate and gave an implied endorsement of another candidate. In the second interview, she advocated for the defeat of one Senate candidate and the election of another candidate. This is all talking about the Alabama Senate race. Both instances constituted prohibited political activity under the Hatch Act and occurred after Conway received significant training on Hatch Act prohibitions. The White House response to that this afternoon: Kellyanne Conway did not advocate for or against the election of any particular candidate. She simply expressed the president's obvious position that he have people in the House and Senate who support his agenda. In fact, Kellyanne's statements actually show her intention and desire to comply with the Hatch Act, as she twice declined to respond to the host's specific invitation to encourage Alabamans to vote for the Republican. That from Hogan Gidley, the White House Deputy Press Secretary. You might remember that Kellyanne Conway was, quote, counseled by the White House when she made a reference to Ivanka Trump's clothing line. I expect if she gets any kind of punishment from the president on this, which I don't expect there will be any, it will merely be a slap on the wrist. Shep?
John Roberts on another busy day at the White House. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson pushing countries to keep the pressure on North Korea, despite signs of what the president called possible progress. As I mentioned, there's word the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un is now open to talks with the United States, and he's open to halting his country's nuclear testing program while those talks are underway. U.S. intelligence chiefs were on Capitol Hill today, where they told Congress that they are skeptical about Kim Jong-un's apparent offer.
I've seen nothing to take me down a path to think that he's about ready to make a hard right turn. But that possibility is there.
We saw the news this morning relative to North Korea. Hope springs eternal, but we need to learn a lot more relative to these talks, and we will.
And so far, it's just talk. Keep that in mind. One of the intelligence chiefs said that he would advise President Trump to proceed with caution, but that the United States should engage in talks with North Korea. Talks with North Korea. That's new and very different. Rich Edson's live at the State Department, but you wonder how real it is. You know, are there, like, the signs on the ground seem to be otherwise, don't they?
Right, Shep, and this is what the United States and the State Department are trying to assess right now, the sincerity of all this, and it doesn't seem as though the U.S. is going to take just a promise of a discussion of denuclearization to be anything monumental. It does move it along, but again, as the sincerity is concerned, they're just not sure about it. Vice President Mike Pence said in a statement, quote, "All options are on the table and our posture towards the regime will not change until we see credible, verifiable, and concrete steps toward denuclearization." So there is skepticism. And officials point out that the U.S. has had dealings with North Korea for decades. They've reached a few agreements, usually to have North Korea go back on those agreements. So the Secretary of State, the Vice President, and others in the administration are saying they're going to continue what they call that maximum pressure campaign. They're getting allies, some adversaries, to isolate North Korea economically, diplomatically, all in an attempt to draw Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table for sincere, actual negotiations, and it's unclear if this is that yet. The South Korean government delivered this offer after 2 days of discussions in Pyongyang. It was the first time that Kim Jong-un officially had met with officials from South Korea. The South Korean President Moon Jae-in has made better relations with North Korea a priority. He ran on that. Part of that was the Olympic issue that you saw there, where South Korea and North Korea got together in the opening ceremonies, and for a joint hockey team, Shep.
What do the North Koreans say they want out of this?
North Korea, honestly, it's unclear specifically what they want. They say they want security, but it's unclear specifically what they want. We do know in previous statements they've wanted the U.S. out of the Korean Peninsula.
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. More ahead from the president's tariff plans and the criticism from members of his own party and the thoughts of his donor base, their objections, and where they say they want the president to go from here. That's coming up from the Fox News deck as we wait for President Trump's news conference, scheduled for live just about 15 minutes from now. We will have it for you in its entirety without commercial interruption on America's Choice for news and information on cable. This is Fox News Channel. Steele. Some Republican leaders are now pushing back on the president, asking him to please reconsider. The chief congressional correspondent Mike Emanuel is live on Capitol Hill. How hard are they pushing here, Mike?
Well, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he wants to make sure these new tariffs don't send the economy in the wrong direction. Republicans want to run on this tax plan, essentially helping the American people. They're worried that this could have a negative impact. McConnell spoke on behalf of his fellow GOP senators a short time ago.
Many of our members are discussing with the administration just how broad, how sweeping this might be. And there's a high level of concern about interfering with what appears to be an economy that's taking off in every respect.
McConnell said there are concerns that this could metastasize into a full-blown trade war, so conversations between congressional Republicans and folks down at the White House continue taking place. Shep.
Mike, the top Democrat in the Senate says he thinks the president is right to go after China.
That's absolutely right. We've heard that from Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and some other Democrats praising President Trump for wanting to step up on behalf of American workers, but they're essentially saying his proposal on new tariffs needs work.
I think China has taken terrible advantage of America over the last decade or two, and they don't play fair. The trouble, we don't know what the details will be, so I don't want to make any final comment, but it seems initially it's not well targeted.
Congress does not appear to have much power to stop the president. He was legally required to notify Congress, but after that, it is believed he's pretty much has the power to do what he wants. Shep.
Mike Emanuel at the Rotunda on Capitol Hill. Mike, thanks a lot. So why is President Trump breaking with Republicans on those import taxes? Why do Republican leaders and the president differ on strategy? Well, some strategists say it's part of a bigger plan to set himself up in some key battleground states ahead of the 2020 election.
Based there, that's one of the resources that the European Union now is threatening to impose tariffs on if Trump actually goes through with these steel import tariffs. So there are certain states and certain communities that, of course, will be impacted, and the Republicans arguing in general consumers are going to see higher prices because of that.
And corporations are, you know, they have a voice in all of this, and that often that goes right through the Speaker's office. Are we hearing any echoes of corporate America in there?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some corporations come out pushing back on this. Of course, trade groups, the AFL-CIO and labor unions coming out in support of this and trying to rally their workers across the country in support of this. But of course, there are some executives. Of course, Trump has a lot of business ties, and many of the people in his administration, Gary Cohn, former Goldman Sachs executive who now is his top economic advisor, pushing back on these trade restrictions and trying to really get into the president's ear and say, look, this is something that's going to have huge ramifications if you go through with it. Of course, there are other voices in the administration, Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, who for the last few years have been encouraging Trump to pursue this type of aggressive strategy. So there's some definitely mixed signals even from the administration itself.
It's interesting to hear from his critics who are saying it's almost as if he's attacking Canada after the Russians attacked us and he didn't mention it. You know, the word that his own Warner used was warfare on the part of the Russians. Has there been any condemnation of the Russians, any attempt to stop the Russians in future meddling?
Well, yeah, I think that we're seeing this kind of Russia probe escalating. At the same time, Trump is trying to voice and flex his control over one thing, trade in this case, guns a couple weeks ago. There's certain huge issues that he is kind of unilaterally making these announcements on or trying to voice support for working with Democrats in Congress while this escalating Russia probe is ongoing. And so we haven't seen any kind of indication from the administration that they're going to pursue those sanctions that Congress passed last year.
Jesse, do we know why not?
We don't have any real indication from the administration, a full-throated reasoning why. They have worked with state officials across the country on making sure that they have provided safeguards for the upcoming elections. But we have seen some concern on Capitol Hill after the Secretary Rogers' testimony last week or 2 weeks ago, saying that Trump himself hasn't directed him to necessarily make added protection. So there's definitely some tug and pull still going on.
Jesse Burns, associate editor at The Hill. Jesse, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Shep.
Let's take a live look at the East Room of the White House. That's where we're expecting the president to speak at a news conference with the Swedish Prime Minister. That's scheduled for just a few minutes from now. And you heard all that's on John Roberts' plates today, and then that from Jesse Burns. So we'll bring you that when it happens. Reporters waiting to ask questions on a range of topics discussed today, including the recent developments involving North Korea. But first...
That is not good.
No, that is definitely not good. Not good at all. This is Bismarck, North Dakota, a garbage truck sliding sideways across an icy road after a snowstorm. And in the Northeast, in like a lion. March is not about to be nice. Folks all up and down the eastern seaboard, just about 40 million people in the line of a crazy nor'easter that's set to slam this region in just, like tomorrow. Amtrak is already canceling some trains for tomorrow in preparation for the big storm. Amtrak's already going down. It's so nice outside today. The sun's out. It feels like a spring day in Mississippi. And yet tomorrow they're going to just beat us up.
That's often what happens, Shep, is you're seeing that warm air pool out in front of it, but we know it's on the way, and that's why you've got winter storm warnings now stretching from Philadelphia up to New York, through Boston, Portland, Maine, everything inland. Those are going to be areas where you see the heaviest snowfall as this system begins overnight tonight, but really the brunt of it coming tomorrow. Here's a future radar. Pay attention to this because it's going to be important. You do see air slightly warmer here right along the coast, so that rain snow line is going to make a big difference in how much snow you see. If you're further inland, obviously easily getting up to a foot or more, 15 inches, 18 inches in some cases. But right along this snow line, there could be spots that see a couple of inches, and then within a couple of miles, it quickly ramps up. That's something we're going to be paying attention to. But the brunt of this coming late tomorrow into the overnight hours for Thursday, early Thursday morning, it does begin to clear off. How much snow are we talking about? Well, these darker areas are some of those spots getting up to 12 inches to 15 inches or more right along the coast, a little bit less. The model's not exactly coming into line together, some a couple inches, some a half an inch or a half a foot of snow, but that's something we're going to be watching.
The president is set to hold a joint news conference with the Prime Minister of Sweden. We expect that to start at any moment now. Among the topics that could come up, of course, possible talks with North Korea, the president's proposed tariffs, which some of his fellow Republicans say they oppose, and the investigation into Russian meddling in the United States elections. Let's turn to the Associated Press White House reporter Zeke Miller. Good to see you, Zeke.
Good to see you.
Yesterday was a fascinating day of twists and turns with a round of cable news interviews that really was, it was seen by many as a bit bizarre. I wondered if you had reporting on that, what your take was.
Well, Sam Nunberg told my colleague Jill Colvin last night that he was ultimately, he believed, going to cooperate with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And looking back on it, it was somewhat a little bit reminiscent of some of President Trump's call-ins with cable news stations and reporters all through the campaign, and even beforehand when he was a reality television star. So a way of dominating the news cycle, and then ultimately maybe not so much following through on some of those results. But there was an element to it that you can see how how the president and Sam Nunberg used to work together, because there were some similarities and commonalities there in their approach to the press.
The thing that I found interesting, and Zeke, I'd like your opinion on this, going back, I guess Nunberg had been with him since 2011, 2012, and was one of the people who was sort of intimately involved with the process leading up to the announcement that he would run for president. And I wonder if that would be revelatory of anything.
Well, it potentially could be, but that doesn't seem to be what the special counsel is interested in from that subpoena that Sam Nunberg did release. Mueller was looking for correspondence starting in sometime November of 2015, the fall of 2015, after Nunberg really had already been his relationship with the campaign had, as far as we know, been severed. But he was, of course, in contact with people in the Trump orbit: Steve Bannon, Roger Stone, others who had close contacts with the president, and others, and had their own